avoid you, Martin.
I can imagine why.
For those of you who don't know, is that Ireland came over to New Zealand and beat New Zealand in rugby for the first time ever.
3-2. That's I'm not sure, Saikat, what the equivalent in cricket is, because I don't know the scoring system in cricket, but let's just say it's a relative whitewash that Ireland just wiped the floor with New Zealand, which for us historically on home territory for New Zealand, unheard of.
That's amazing. So you have a happy Martin.
Yeah, but always cautious, because New Zealand don't roll over like that in rugby. So I think the World Cup, if they can get themselves sorted out, which they seem to have done against Argentina, what was it, 55-5?
53-3. Yep.
Yeah. So you're looking at it saying, okay, they just had a little blip on the road, but they could come back 10 times stronger after that. So there won't be any gloating, but happy to have put that series in the bag, Kelvin, I'll tell you. Bragging rights for the next 10 years at least.
So I think it's you, because I think the first time that the All Blacks lost in Ireland, I was in Dublin meeting with you that day.
That's right.
So,
Yeah.
Okay, gentlemen, and welcome all. Welcome, Kelvin, Egbert, Saikat, and we are now live on our social media channels.
Cool.
Let me start this by putting our introductory video, and then we roll the show. Is that okay for all?
Cool.
Let's do that then.
My name is Paul Hofstede. I am a certified professional facilitator from the IAF, which stands for International Association of Facilitators. Since 2018, I've started a book series on architecting collaboration, and my latest book, in co-authorship with other renowned digital facilitators and guest co-authors, is titled Beyond Virtual Meetings. It's all about the importance of the digital tools that can extend and augment the power of you as a facilitator and a meeting host in a virtual online meeting, but also on the hybrid meetings that are going to be so much needed in this post-pandemic era.
Along with my co-author Martin Duffy and esteemed PhD colleague, we host Talk to Your Meeting Daughter, a series of hosted conversations with meeting experts that can advise you about how to transition to this new normal and take advantage of this incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to make the organization of your meetings more sustainable. Please stand by as the next show will start momentarily.
Great to be here. Great to be back here at the episode 9. And this time we are using a different platform for our broadcast. This is Zoom. We're all traditional with. And as we have more participants joining the Zoom room, we probably extend the dialogue to after the show for more in-depth discussions. Martin, we normally start by asking a quick question to participants. Do you want to go?
Yeah, well, we normally like to find out some little secret that you might have, guys, that you haven't previously shared too widely, but that you might just be willing to share with our audiences this morning. Something that you did, someplace you've been, something a little bit unexpected.
Good. So who wants to go first?
Killed in the rush, as normal, Paul.
Yes, I understand that.
Alphabetical ordering, Paul, is your preferred choice.
Yeah, Egbert, go ahead. And
I've been actively trying not to speak first, but now I'm invited, so I don't have a choice. A secret, maybe a riddle. what did I do 14 times taking off in an airplane before I ever landed?
It's too obvious that you jumped out of it.
Exactly.
Because I used to fly the Egbert, and I've flown people jumping out of airplanes, and I always said, why would you do that?
Yeah, that's the question I asked myself the second time. The first time it was more like, yeah, well, whatever. The second time you're conscious, and then you realize, yeah, this is actually quite nuts.
Crazy.
But yeah, that was a funny riddle.
Well done. Cool. Nice.
Cool, Egbert. Thank you so much. Next in line, Kelvin.
I don't know. So I don't know if it's a secret or not. But I've been skiing many years with my son, and this year was the first year that he skis faster than me.
It's all technique. It's all technique, Kelvin. It's not about age. Don't worry.
And Saikat, your turn now.
Not many people know about this, but when I was in school, and we had these trains passing by, and we used to have the level crossing, which used to close so that the trains pass. And I don't know what happened, and I decided to cross right in front of a train and walk across. Then I wondered, exactly like Egbert said, that why would I have done that? And,
oh, wow, jeez.
That's
Still
amazing.
wondering.
That's amazing, amazing. Well, sometimes we behave like we behave. We don't know. Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's
You've all
cool.
done that.
But anyway, it's glad that we all shared a little bit. And Martin, I think you probably have something prepared for our conversations, or?
Well, as usual, Paul, very little. So the aim of our discussions, guys, we like the fireside chat format because we don't get too structured. We didn't give you guys any advanced questions or notes. I haven't prepared any fancy questions or anything. We'll take the conversation where it goes. But just looking at the title of our discussion, Untangling the Myth of Org Assessment, I suppose from your experience, my first question would be the myth. What myths have you encountered in your experience of organizational assessment? Are there myths that we do need to untangle?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Kelvin, you've been around a good few mythological meeting spheres at this stage. What would your take be on the myth factor?
So I think the biggest myth would be that there's a single measurement which can tell you everything, and that you can treat the organization as a single entity rather than lots and lots of different entities that are doing different things.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a bit of untangling to be done in there, isn't there? Yeah. Egbert, Saikat?
I'm smiling, and I'm really actively trying not to speak first, so I'll stick with being invited to counter my urge. Because
just jump in, Egbert. That's the way that this one works. Just jump in anytime. So
when I open my mouth on culture, I mean, I've been working in the organizational assessment sphere for the last 2 decades. We assess so many organizations every year. I'd say the first myth is that organizational culture cannot be measured. Economist recently published, I think it was early July edition, that's organizational culture, a lot of talk, but very little data. So that's one myth, that it can't be measured.
Yeah.
The second myth is connected to that organizational culture goes hand in hand with employee satisfaction / engagement. So a bit of confusion in terms of what actually is culture. And that's the third myth, which is organizational culture, national culture, they're the same. So those are 3 things that we often encounter in terms of the mythical status connected to untangling culture.
Excellent. Yeah. Gosh.
I'll go.
Sure.
Sorry.
Go
ahead. No.
Go ahead.
No, I was saying pretty much agree with both of them. And of course, I'm not as experienced with the organization assessments as they are. But I think, probably there is a myth around, organizations wanting to measure what they want to measure and not what they don't want to measure. Yeah,
I like that one. I like that one because it really brings out the element of what works for one company doesn't work for another. What is considered open in one company is considered closed in another. So it's so contextual that it really does add to the, how do you call it, mysticism of is one culture.
We've got an old joke in Ireland, kind of similar to that one or related to that one, about the drunk who's under a lamppost looking for his car keys. And the policeman asks him, "What are you doing?" He says, "I'm looking for my car keys." "Okay, and where do you remember having them last?" And he said, "Well, over in the car park." And the policeman said, "Well, why are you looking here?" He said, "Because there's a lot of light here." So maybe our organizational measurement, Saikat, is around, we measure what we like as opposed to what we need to. So there's crikey, guys, we could be here for half a day talking about just your opening comments on this one. So where do you start with untangling any of these myths?
Maybe I'll go first. And again, probably the least experienced, but I think maybe organizations may to untangle it from engagement and feel good factors, that Egbert maybe you were referring to, right? And really say that, why do I even need to do this? Is this important for my strategy, right? If it's not, then do you really need to measure anything, right? So is there a strategic intent behind why you want to measure something? Probably if you start from there, then maybe the untangling can begin in some ways. But happy to hear other views.
Maybe I'll add to that, because like you just touched upon something very important, which is that organizational culture only exists by the virtue of the strategy of an organization. Like organizations will have a culture, whether they are conscious of building it, running it, maintaining it, shaping it or not, it'll happen when people come together. But if you want to untangle what's the impact of a particular culture or subcultures, as Kelvin also related to, you need to benchmark it with the strategy of the company, but also the context. I'll give you an example of that. If you want more diversity in an organization, you would ideally build an organizational culture where people identify with their job, not with the boss, not with the team, not with the organization, but with their job, because then it doesn't matter what is the background of somebody. If they're good at their job, they're a good colleague. But the downside of having that is that you have more turnover because people move easier. They move to whatever the next challenge lies. So that then means that if the labor market is highly competitive, then as an organization, your strategy, increased diversity, needs to be balanced with what's the reality on the labor market. So there are two components connected to the observation of, does our organizational culture support us in executing a strategy today, but also in the future, because it takes ages to turn a culture around.
But is that a circular type of argument, Egbert, in that if the culture is almost derived from the strategy, but then the strategy starts to be driven by the underlying culture, have we got a potentially virtuous or non-virtuous circle going on between those two?
Yes, it's a short answer.
Yeah. So how do you untangle it? How do you measure it? Where do you start? It becomes a key. If you're in a circle doesn't have a start or an end. So
I'd say, like in daily practice, where we would normally start is, what's the current strategy? and how is the current strategy influenced by whatever happens in the surroundings of an organization.
Yeah.
Then you map out what is the current culture and also what is the desired culture, meaning what is it that people would like to have. Because that also tells you a little bit if your strategy is going in a direction where it currently is not, and where people also don't want it to be, you'll fail your strategy. So with any loop, it takes a bit of courage and an ability to deal with uncertainty from a management and ownership perspective, because they're not necessarily the same. To say, okay, this is where we are with our current strategy. This is where our current culture is. So let's take an informed decision based on multiple components. What we have, what we want, what the market does, what our product's positioning is, and then move forward and revisit that every 3 years or every 5 years, depending on the shape of the organization.
Yeah. And Kelvin, actually, that point that Egbert makes there, I think it feeds back into your opening comments that there is no one measure. So there are multiple things to be measured. So again, let me go back to the circle. Where do we start measuring? Where?
Yeah, so it was interesting to hear that about how the strategy and the culture are intertwined. So we start on the other side, and we actually say, what's the latent culture inside the organization? Who are the real leaders? Not who the designated leaders are. Who are the real leaders? And do those leaders want to take the organization in the same way as your actual overall strategy? And you can measure the difference between those two things in a similar way to what you've just described, but we're actually coming in at the circle from a different place. And then once you actually then have, when you have the strategy, you then take into account the existing leadership, and then you try and bump the existing leadership, or the informal leaders, if you like, which you can measure, and you use them to actually drive the organization strategy in the way that you would like to do it.
Yeah, there's two things that you've said there, Kelvin, that strike me, but the one that's kind of jumping off the page to me here is the formal leadership versus the informal leadership. The concept of latent leadership. I'm kind of intrigued. I'm intrigued by that idea. So the bit that you can't see easily, I'm guessing, has to become harder to measure, harder to quantify, less visible. Saikat, any experience of that, insights into that concept of the leadership piece that Kelvin is talking about?
Yeah, maybe to build on that a little bit, right? I think, obviously there are a lot of theories on leadership and what is leadership, right? Mm-hmm. But essentially the way, I look at it is that leadership is obviously not a position. It mm-hmm. derives from who you are. And, essentially if you don't have followers, you are not a leader. And so anybody who is able to then have followers, for good or bad, is a leader, whether it is formally stated or it's latent in some ways, right? So I think, so leadership is a set of behaviors, right? Essentially, it's a set of behaviors which is inspiring another set of people to, kind of follow you in something that you're trying to drive. But I think from an organization assessment perspective, I would say that the starting point has to be that, going back to the point that Egbert was making about management and ownership, right? Essentially, anybody who has an ownership mindset, who's going to take accountability for performance, right? Because at the end of the day, it's all about performance, right? And to make that performance happen, what are the cultural elements that I need in place? And then, because I want some distance and because I want some independence in that assessment, can I depend on some third-party assessments to come in and actually tell me what is true. So in my view, I think, right, and I'm also learning a lot in this conversation itself already. But in my view, the starting point is somebody who is owning and owns the mandate for the organization, in an official capacity, determines that there are a few cultural elements that are really important for us to be able to achieve this. It could be diversity, it could be something completely different, and saying that, now how do I know how are we doing and what to fix? So I mean, I know maybe it was not a direct answer, but Martin, that's my response. Yeah.
No, but actually, and you see what I'm kind of intrigued now by, we've come at this now from at least three different perspectives. But I'm thinking back to the original opening comments that we made, and Kelvin, I'm really drawn back to this idea. There is no one organizational measurement that we can make. But then, Egbert, I'm drawn to your idea of this circle of strategy versus culture. I'm then drawn to the concept of leadership versus culture. And then, so how do we assess all of these things? So this problem then of untangling those, and where to start with untangling them in order to make meaningful organizational assessment. And then I think, Saikat, your comment there, that we kind of logically, I guess, need to start with who is the visible leadership position. But then we have to look to, so where's the latent leadership going on? Where's the hidden leadership? And I think your point about followership, that, again, I'm really intrigued by that notion, because it's very easy to say, there's the leader, analyze that, assess that, measure that. But without followers, there is no leader. So then what about, well, maybe assessing the followers? Why do they follow? What do they follow? When do they stop following? And does that tell us where the org strategy might be heading or might not be heading? Guys, we're up to a day at this stage. We could be here for a day instead of a half day.
Maybe give you a bit of in terms of also connecting it to the notion of there's no one culture. Look at it from this perspective. Every organization has functional teams. It has hierarchical layers. Whether that is with a certain degree of formality or not, that will differ according to national culture, according to business industry.
Yeah.
But in every organization, there have to be certain behaviors. We define them basically as bonding elements. Doesn't matter whether you work in, let's say, an organization in India or that same organization in Australia. The ideal scenario is that there are elements that make you feel like home.
Yeah.
However, there are also elements, we call them functional diversity elements, which have to be fine-tuned to the function per se. Meaning a sales team can be, for example, a lot more action-oriented than the audit team, which needs to be much more compliance-oriented.
Yeah.
However, if you want them to work together, there has to be a bonding element. So to the equation, or my statement would be, every organization should ideally have elements that are common across the organization to ensure bonding and efficiency and feeling of belonging, while at the same time also being or allowing for functional differences. That way you can basically get both, and a sense of belonging and a sense of similarity, yet at the same time a sense of operational freedom, which will work better for some units than others.
Mm.
And then to add to that complexity, if you do that within an organization that is geographically spread, the notion of formal leadership, informal leadership is also informed by national cultural characteristics.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because if leaders are not clearly visible in hierarchical cultures, then basically it means nothing will get done because nobody is sure about what is it that we're being rewarded for. So it makes that discussion of a day easily stretch into a discussion of a week, because you also need to be mindful of the fact that, okay, and this is where, again, I have to push it back to the strategy angle. Mm-hmm. What is it that you want to achieve in particular geographical regions? And what are the type of leadership styles that help you to develop practices that make strategic sense and are emotionally sustainable? So it's a combo.
Yeah, but it's so amazing, Egbert, because when listening to you, then I feel this urge as a manager with how do I measure all those important variables? How do I measure them?
Well, become our customer and the answer shall appear.
Yeah, and definitely that's what we also would like to, if I might step in, Martin, here, share, if you be so kind to share us with a little bit of war stories. For instance, I was listening to my podcast yesterday, and I totally identified with what I was listening, because I was a manager myself. I was a CEO on a large organization, and the thing is that the consultant arrives with the data and says to the CEO, "I know the problem of this organization is all about," and the CEO, "Hey, tell me, the problem is you, because your leadership style does not allow for people to have their own voices." and so sometimes I would say that what I would do if I was the CEO, I would immediately fire that consultant, right?
I think you touched upon on a very important note regarding culture, and it was mentioned earlier also by Saikat in terms of and the story, Martin, you told about searching in the light. What a lot of organizational analytical approaches, in our opinion, do very smartly, but let's say we don't think it works, is to tell you this is the you need to have. An organization says you want innovation, or they say they want innovation. The consultant comes in, they measure the culture, they say, well, in order to do innovation, you need to basically get this kind of a culture. That is not the judgment call for a consultant to make, because the reflection should be, what's the type of innovation that you need? You need process innovation, you need disruptive innovation. Depending on the angle, you need to have different leadership styles to allow for mistakes or to not allow for mistakes. The leaders in those teams, are they the type of leaders that inspire meticulousness, preciseness, meaning follow the process? Or are they the leaders that kind of inspire, let people try out, trial and error? Well, if your strategy is about process innovation, but you're steering for disruptive innovation, your culture is basically going to end up like a GE did, losing 2/3 of its stock value in 6 years, because the strategy and the culture are diametrically opposed. Yeah. So part of the untangling is also an understanding of how homogeneous or heterogeneous is the culture. Because some organizations, they actually don't have any uniting factors. They have no culture in that sense. They are a brand, but the working practices are so spread out that if you ask somebody in one unit something about the other unit, they don't even know each other.
Yeah. One of the things we haven't talked about is the role of the customer. And so we talk about the culture of the customer and then how you actually align the culture of your organization. And I think you just touched on one of those points there. There's no point in striving for innovation and people taking chances if your customers are in the nuclear industry, for instance. So you actually the culture that you also have to be mindful of is measuring the culture of your customers, measuring the culture of your organization, and looking to see where the match is, and where you want the deep matches. Then what's your strategy to actually align those two things? And if you want to break out of that, of whatever segment you're in, I mean, why are you breaking out of that? For instance, you know, if your strategy is to change your culture, are you changing in advance to your customers or behind them?
I just have to jump in on that word customer, because one very important question to ask is, who is your customer? And is it your call? Because like often what you run into is sales teams, they sell whatever, only for delivery to be confronted with a reality that, oh, did we offer this? So customership is also based on business model. If you have low volume, high margin, you can basically build a culture around adjusting to whatever the customer asks you. If your business model is high volume, low margin, any sense of tailoring will eat into your profitability. So this adds to the untangling part, is another factor besides strategy, market, is what's your business model?
It's amazing. I'm learning so much with you guys.
Yeah, there's the analogy that's forming in my head here is the plate of spaghetti. that if the organization is, because you're painting the picture of a plate of spaghetti, and the challenge then to untangle that, you can't look at any individual strand in isolation, and at the same time, by looking at all of the strands simultaneously, you can only see a fraction of the whole plate of spaghetti. So I suppose from a philosophically and then practically. So there's probably two questions that we're being forced to address our theme of this discussion. So philosophically and then practically, how do we start to untangle? Because we've shown what the tangle starts to sound like and look like. Very complex, layered, strategy-driven, culture-driven, leadership-driven, national culture-driven, customer-base-driven. So they're all the strands of the spaghettis that are making up the organization. So philosophically, let's start with that one. Where might we start to untangle? And then let's talk about how we might go about doing it.
So if I may come in here,
Sure, yeah.
So I think, you know, culture is something which is many ways abstract, right? We feel it. It's a perception,
yeah,
right? And which is why I think I like what Kevin said, that there's probably no one metric to measure it, right? There are multiple dimensions of it. And I think the other starting point for me would be to say that, hey, there is no one right culture.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what organization, doesn't matter which country, doesn't matter which industry. You know, I'm sure there are organizations in the same industry, in the similar country, which has two very different cultures, and both are doing well, right? It's about how are they managed, how comfortable are they with their own culture, rather than anybody from the outside prescribing what's the right culture for them. And to me, therefore, it's philosophically, I think it's an internal question, right? It's a question as to who am I? I mean, to be extremely philosophical, as an individual, who am I? And then the company asking, who am I, right?
Yeah.
Am I a responsible, smart organization? Am I a ruthless money-making machine? Am I a place where I want people to flourish? So it's a question, I think, that starts from within. Yeah. And then you measure it. And the measurement has to be, again, in my view, perception-based. I mean, that's one of the ways, right? Something I see less often being happening. For example, let's speak about diversity, equity, inclusion, right? Now, there are tons and tons of research out there which says that, okay, diversity, equity, inclusion is great for business. There are, so many reports which say that, okay, organizations which are doing X amount on diversity, equity, inclusion have X factor more in terms of their return on capital and so on and so forth, right? Now, in spite of all of that, why is it that organizations, or most organizations where we know that at least so-called smart people work, are not genuinely being diverse or inclusive? Whereas if you look at all the PR, they are the most inclusive places on earth, right? Mm-hmm. So the thing is, I think the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? So if as an organization I'm saying that I think I am extremely inclusive and I have ABCD policies which make sure that we are inclusive, then go test it out with your employees and say, hey, do you feel that you belong? Do you feel belonged here? Do you feel you can be your authentic self? Do you feel that you are treated equally like another gender or somebody else? Check the perception. It may not be reality, it's perception. Because I think the truth about culture is that it is perception. So you need to check for perception. So if the bulk of the organization comes back and says that, hey, we don't feel like we are being ourselves, then the organization needs to understand that, hey, in spite of all the right intentions that we have and all the great policies that we have and all the communication that we are doing, our people don't seem to be feeling that. And that's the starting point of saying that, oh, okay, let's investigate this further, rather than saying that, okay, now we know we have measured this and we've got it all sorted. We know where exactly we're going wrong. Sorry for the long interlude.
Maybe to add on this. So for example, one reason why in our approach, we never start by disclosing the results of a measurement is because people across the world have an uncanny ability to want to not deviate too much from their score. And as a facilitator, there's nothing more fun. Well, yeah, it is fun to present or to facilitate a management team's meeting on what should be their optimal culture. Optimal meaning not what they would like, but what they can and need to have, given the market in which they operate, external restraints, legislation, regulation impacting their business. You let them go through that workshop, and then only in a second workshop you actually you show the results and you show the gap, kind of like a shock and awe philosophy, because then they realize, oh, actually, yeah, we realize we have an issue with productivity, but we don't want to become much harder. Because then you know that, okay, you touched an actual value, you actually touched the gut with a management team. And that's where it has to start. A management team has to feel in their gut that there is something off between what they state, what they say, and what they do. And because in the end, if a management team is not aligned on this, it will basically cycle through the rest of the organization. That's where silo formation starts taking place. A management team, I don't know, in the last 20 years, I think of the amount of management teams that actually act like a team and not as a collection of gifted individuals. They're not many.
Yeah, I think that's probably a global cultural trend very broadly, but the individualism trend which sucks the life out of the concept of team. But yeah, that's those two ideas there are really, really interesting. That if you start with the perception piece, what do our people in the organization, what do they actually feel or think? And then you switch back to, and what does the leadership team think our people think? And it's that gap. But Kelvin, knowing what I know about your background and your particular area in meeting quality, that delta, that gap is really so important, isn't it? In measuring, assessing, evaluation. Isn't that where we learn so much about anything, really?
Yeah, exactly. So, and we put a lot of effort into that. So So we're slightly different because we measure meetings. There's a lot of digital exhaust inside meetings that we can actually pick up around the culture.
Haven't heard that one before, Kelvin. Digital exhaust.
And so if you've got some clever AI, you can actually pick up what the culture is pretty much on a real-time basis if you're measuring lots of meetings. And we don't just measure meetings. We measure something about what the meeting's for. If it's a project, we're measuring it for a project. If it's for a customer, so we're not just measuring it for it to be that sake. But a byproduct of that is that we're able to actually map in real time the culture of the organization. So we can compare what our customers think our culture should be, because we can see what's happening. We can see, as I alluded to earlier, we can see what the executive thinks, we can see what management thinks, we can see what practitioners think. And the triangulation, I don't know if you can triangulate 5 things, but you know where I'm coming from. The triangulation of that then allows you to see where the mismatches are. And, you know, I talked earlier about looking to see who the informal leaders are. If the informal leaders don't believe in the strategy, and you can see that there's a mismatch and they're taking the organization somewhere where the executive doesn't want to go, there's something has to happen. And so there's 2 things you can do, is that you can pretty much sack the informal leaders, which happens quite a lot. Or you can recognize them and actually inspire them to actually deliver the things that you'd like to deliver for your strategy. And measuring that in real time gives an organization a huge sort of advantage.
Martin, I think you're muted.
Yeah, isn't that the key? It's the in real time, as opposed to let's run the survey today. Let's collate all the data in a month's time, and then let's suppress all the data a week after that because, well, we just didn't get around to dealing with it, or, well, that was last month's priority. Now we've done it, tick the box, move on. So the real-time measurement piece, feedback loop piece, is that a key part of untangling, as opposed to tick a box and let's all just keep doing what we're doing.
So I'd add one more thing to that. And I have this thing I call survey result democracy. So I'm exactly the opposite about results. Everybody should see whatever results that they can see that where they participate in a survey. And that's part of that feedback loop. All right. So everybody, so it takes a bit of maturity. But we had you're talking about some of the problems that you've experienced. So even when we bring customers into the loop for some of the surveys that we do at the end of meetings or during meetings, the customers get to see the results as well. And you have to be quite mature as an organization to be able to actually let some of your warts out.
I think maybe to add on this, I think like there are 2 components that philosophers also differ. I think one of the big differentiators that we leverage in our practice is that we have a fairly robust database built up over the last 37 years. So what we do is we look at patterns. In other words, individual answers don't really matter. It's what is the variance in the answers that we get? What does that tell us? What are the broad tendencies? Because one of the potential downsides, and that's why that context is so important, and you can capture it either by measuring just factual questions on context, or indeed, like as Kelvin refers to, measuring it in real time. But the point is, if we all the time follow the pulse of the organization, what we risk, and it's also a national cultural approach. In the Anglo-Saxon world, everything is more real time and more short. The risk with this is that people zoom in too much and forget the broader picture. They look at the actual event, not at the trend. And when you want to transform a culture, it's not that short-term events aren't useful data, because they are, because it will inform communication choices like COVID, for example. But if you don't zoom out and only follow the day-to-day reflection or opinions, what you risk doing from a cultural perspective is to follow trends. And that means you are being led. You're not actually shaping your culture, taking into account trends, but not letting the trends dictate the choice. Just as a philosophical reflection, that you kind of need to have, it's call it like dual vision. You need to look short term and long term.
Yeah, actually, in my own research on meetings, one of the revelations that I came across was what another researcher called zooming in and zooming out, and it was the idea that you needed to be able to simultaneously have this dual perspective, the zoomed in, to be able to see fine detail, be in the moment, understand what's happening in the instant, but equally being able to zoom out to see, so where's the contextual, where does that sit contextually? Now that philosophy applies in kind of all areas. It wasn't just about the meeting stuff that I was studying. As a philosophy, that touches really strongly, Egbert, into what you're saying there. So then, if we go back to that original circle that we talked about, the culture and the strategy circle piece, and then if we superimpose onto that the leadership followership piece, we superimpose onto that the whole internal staff versus the external customer piece. In all of them, there's a need, is there? Well, here's the question. Is there a need to have this duality of vision, this zoomed in perspective, but with this constant zoomed out monitor, overview, trend analysis? Is that a key part of the untangling that we're actually talking about?
I mean, being raised as a forester myself,
woods and trees.
But yeah, like, so basically from an environmental psychology point of view, like what being trained as a forester helps you to do is that you are making actions today to harvest in 50, Finland, 100 years from now.
Yeah.
If you are running into harsh economical times, like organizations do, 80 years from now, who cares? You need to flatten the forest now and harvest it all, because otherwise you won't exist 80 years from now. However, if you don't, or if you see, okay, money is coming better from tourism as opposed to one particular type of wood, you switch part of the forest to cater to that industry. So in the whole philosophical approach, untangling culture requires is not just an HR thingy. It is not something that an SVP of culture and people should look at alone. It has to be a strategic management team activity to consciously and continuously reflect on, is the way we work still supporting our strategy today? And how does it relate to if the scenario changes? So that organizations can become more mindful about why they do the things the way they do things.
Yeah.
Yeah, if I can come in here, right? I think Martin used, painted the picture of 3 layers, so to say, right? And I think that's right. But I'm probably also looking at them in a more linear way.
Okay.
Right? So starting with the outer circle, which is, let's say, or the first bit, which is the strategy. But the strategy here is not just, just strategy as in the traditional sense that we understand, but it incorporates, what Kelvin is speaking about as customers. It includes what society wants, right? So, this entire concept of ESG, although, I'm not getting there. I'm not getting into the term ESG, but essentially stakeholder capitalism, right? Now, that and that varies significantly from industry to industry and country to country. But essentially, that's the outside in view. And as an organization, I'm saying that in my context, this is how I want to win. This is how I want to perform. And I believe that this is the kind of culture I need. Now, if you believe that this is the culture that you need, the transmission falters sometimes, right? either because of the latent leadership issue, or it could be because of multiple, it could be structural issues like, how is the organization set up? It could be because of policies. And that's when you measure, possibly those two gaps essentially. So one is, as an owner, I intend something, what is actually being perceived by, employees, what's the gap there? And maybe what's also the gap between how I intend my culture to be and what is the best fit for the context in which I'm operating, right? For example, if you're in an industry, let's say in an technology industry, and you want to really innovate a lot, and therefore you want to draw in young talent, right? And then, but I, as an owner, I believe that I have come from an industry which has been very hierarchical, and I want to develop an extremely hierarchical, organization and give very clear roles and responsibilities and accountabilities to everybody. That may not be the right ask or right intent in the context that you're operating in. So if we say that the key user of any organization assessment is, let's say, the business owner, and that can be, a single person, it can be a management, and so on and so forth, then there are two gaps that they need to understand. That the culture that I'm trying to build, is that the best in my context? And secondly, the culture that I'm trying to build, is it percolating down in the right way, and where is the gap, if at all there is? So to me, it's a bit of a linear way that I'm looking at it right now. And of course, they all feed into each other, but yeah. And just one more point to add on. I think this other interesting point on the, what you call the grasshopper view, right? I mean, you're looking both the long distance as well as looking at a very microscopic level. I think organization assessments are great, I think, to give you an intermediate check. You can't do organization assessments too often. There'll be fatigue. There'll be a lot of other issues with that. But isn't the job of a manager or leaders down the line to really connect with people in their teams? Isn't that the foundation of culture? And how is one person interacting with other? That's the foundation of culture, and that, in a team. Yeah. Now, do you want to measure that, or do you want to keep a watch out for it? That, for example, if there is a large sales team, for example, right, and there is a business unit leader, and maybe there are let's say 10 different territory managers reporting into this person, and those 10 territory managers have another 10 people reporting into each one of them, right? Now, I think we were speaking about a quick trend pattern picking up. Now, for example, there is probably a very nice, well-set culture that all of them believe in, but suddenly there are 2 territory managers where I'm noticing something different. I'm noticing that the team is not coming up and presenting. I'm noticing that they're not opening their mouth in the meetings. I'm noticing that they are not dissenting enough or at the appropriate times. Yeah. Now, as a leader, I need to be able to pick that up. That this is something's happening here. And to be able to do that, I may not be able to depend on an external assessment. I need to build that capability in myself to be able to be aware of what's happening in some ways. Is at least how I think of it.
Maybe to jump on that, and then I do need to step out to actually facilitate a cultural workshop. To build on this, it is not just like these indeed biannual measurements. It is also like, how do you incorporate this into the metrics of the organization? If you find it important that managers connect with people, are they being evaluated for this? Is it being taken into compensation? Because people skills, if that level of emotional intelligence / attachment, if they are important, it has to be structurally embedded in the way the organization works. Otherwise, it's just a checkbox. And you can basically reflect on this element. Metrics are not just the actual biannual, annual, or daily measurements. It's also the structures that you build that radiate symbolically in terms of what is it that you really believe that this organization stands for. And if that is about managers paying attention to people, it has to be visible in the way they're compensated, because in the end, that is part of the equation as to why people work.
Yeah.
But on that note, I have to step out. My apologies.
No, absolutely. It's time for us to get a closure here, right? And definitely to thank you all for this wonderful conversation. And first of all, Martin, really thankful for the way you led this one, because this one was interesting, as I was proposing this conversation title myself, and this is out of nothing. We are discussing this very interesting subject, and the way you handled it was perfect, Martin. And thank you also, Kelvin and Saikat, for taking the time for joining us. And of course, Egbert is already departed for his workshop.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just share here a slide on the next episode, because we have already the next episode ready to roll, right? And I will really like you to be a part of it, as we have our followers preferring to join us from LinkedIn instead of from Zoom, as we offer the option. So thank you so much, Saikat, Kelvin, and Egbert, for being in this conversation here. I think that we can move the next slide here. Right, so this is the next episode. Episode 10 will be on 11 October. This time we're going to change the time. Martin, remember, it's going to be 6:30 for your time, right?
That's okay.
Yeah, 6:30 for I would say Greenwich GMT time, and 8:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, where Elise Keith will be joining us, and Miriam Adnes. They are two renowned community builders in facilitation world, and we'll be very pleased to host them. So don't forget also about Beyond Virtual Meetings, the book that Martin and I co-author along a series of other guest authors, including Kelvin, which also is in the room. And that's all for today. Well, I hope you enjoyed the show. Talk to your meeting daughters, and hopefully we'll see you in the next episode again.
Thanks very much, Paul.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much, Paul. Bye, Martin. Thank you so much.
Bye,
Thank you,
folks.
Kelvin. Wonderful meeting you.
Nice to meet you
Bye.
too. So are you going to stay on for a minute, Martin?